Welcome on into the Third Down Analysis podcast. I'm your host, Danny Jackson, and today we're going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to start my deep dive preview of BYU Big 12 opponents, and that's going to start with Kansas State. And then second, I'm going to pivot and address a question I've been thinking about. Does the Big 12 have the best quarterback room of any conference in the country? Alright, so Kansas State, what I'm going to be doing over the next 4 weeks as we ramp up to start of the season is I'm going to go through each of BYU's Big 12 opponents. I'm going to start with Kansas State. I'm going to go through the order in terms of the schedule of when they play, so Baylor will be next. And I take a data-driven approach to this. And so I'm going to give you a couple different angles from high level, from offensive view, from a defensive view, and a lot of that's going to be analysis and data driven, and then I'm going to actually walk through some charts and graphs that I've put together that will help display some of what I'm seeing when I look at Kansas State. This is fun for me. I love doing this. This is just a side gig, side hobby that I really enjoy. I typically put this kind of stuff together in my day job, and so it's fun to do this here. So with Kansas State, let me walk you through here a couple things. First, I'm gonna give you a 30,000 foot view on their program. Second, I'm gonna give you an offensive overview at a high level, and then a defensive overview at a high level, and then I'm gonna pull up some data, and we're gonna walk through that together here. Now, if you're on podcast and you're listening to this, then you're not gonna be able to see my screen, and that's okay. I will walk through it. If you're on video and you're on YouTube, then you're going to be able to see what I'm displaying here in a second. So what I've got here is if it looks like a business presentation, that's because it is. That's what I do in my day job. But anyways, it's really fun for me to do it. So Kansas State here. When you look at the key storylines that I see coming into this season for that program, there are three specific stories that I see for them in particular. The first is that they have an opportunity to elevate themselves to be one of the top programs in the Big 12. Now, they're looking at this conference and they're seeing that Oklahoma and Texas just left. And so the field is wide open. There's several other teams that are thinking the same thing, but in the minds of the Wildcats, this conference is open to for a program to rise to the top and run it similar to how Oklahoma and Texas did for the last decade or 2 decades. And Kansas State has been good the last few years. They are historically a good program. They're what I would label probably a B+ program across the country. They can get into that A- territory. Some years they're a B program, but they're a good, solid program. Now, they have an opportunity to win the Big 12 this year. They have good talent. They have a workable, manageable schedule in the sense that their difficult games are at home, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But let's fast forward. Let's imagine that they actually win the Big 12 this year. They get to the CFP. That's going to be really big for them. Now, I could see a world where they win this year, and let's say they win in 2 years again. All of a sudden now they've put together a string of 3 out of the last 5 years where they've won the Big 12. And if you think about what happened to the Utah program, and I know I'm gonna talk about Utah, which is gonna irk some of you and others. It won't bother too much, but think about what happened to Utah before they won the Pac-12 2 years in a row. They weren't seen as the program that they are seen as now. They win two times in a row. Last year, I think everyone gives them the benefit of the doubt for the injuries. I do too, and when you see how they are expected to perform coming into the Big 12, they're ranked the highest and they're expected to win the Big 12. Now, I do think they're a really good program. I think they deserve a lot of that, a lot of those accolades. But the perception and the brand value that can change in a program when you win a couple of conference championships within the span of a few years, you see that has some real effects. Now, that's the first big story that I see here. The second big story is Avery Johnson. He's their quarterback that he played a few games last season, but whether or not he propelled Will Howard to leave and go to Ohio State, or Will Howard simply got a really good deal to go to Ohio State, I don't know. But the people in Manhattan, Kansas are really thrilled about Avery Johnson. They're really high on his expectations. If you haven't been following, he's received some mention as dark horse to win the Heisman. So that's how good some people think he is. I'll get into him in a little bit more detail here in a bit. But then the third story, as it relates to BYU, because again, these are BYU opponent previews, is that the timing of the matchup is going to be, in my opinion, the best time for BYU to face Kansas State. And that's because Kansas State's offense, they've gone through a lot of change, and it's going to take them, as it does most teams, a little bit of time to get that offense into gear. So BYU playing them at the beginning of the year when theoretically they're going to be about as healthy as they are going to be for most of the year. That, I think, is the best time for BYU to play Kansas State. First game of the Big 12 season. So that's going to be a really hard game for BYU. But if you're going to play them early in this situation, in my opinion. All right, now Kansas State's historical performance over the last several years. You can see here, I've got on screen that Chris Kleiman, their current head coach, this is his 6th season, and his first season they went 8-5. His second season in 2020 they went 4-6, and then they've really been climbing up since then. 8-5, 2022 when they won the Big 12, they went 10-4. They finished 9th overall in the college football playoff rankings, and then last year they went 9-4. So, and they've been to 4 bowl games underneath him. They've gone 2-2 in those bowl games. Last year in the famous Pop-Tarts Bowl, which got quite a bit of notoriety for their mascot. But anyways, so that's where they are coming into the season. And when I look at this year, and I've got on screen here what their schedule is. So I've got them going 9-3. That would put them finishing 4th in the Big 12 because I've got them going 6-3 in the conference. Now, when you look down their schedule, they've got Arizona as their first big game. That's week 3. That's at home, which is good for Kansas State. What's interesting there is that was actually scheduled before before Arizona joined the Big 12, so that game does not count as a Big 12 game. And then they got BYU, and then they've got home against Oklahoma State. So they've got a couple of difficult games. BYU is going to be a difficult game, and so they've got a tough early stretch. And then I've got them going to Colorado. It might surprise some of you that I think that's going to be their first loss, and that's because that's a hard stretch for them to go through. They're going to be coming off of a bye that week, so that could favor them. But Colorado and Kansas State have history, and Colorado is improved coming into this year. Going to Colorado, it's going to be, even though they've got history, they're going to have to be scouting each other for the first time in a while. And in my opinion, that favors the home team. And then they've got West Virginia. So I've got that as a loss. They go at West Virginia. That's not going to be an easy game. They come home against Kansas. Right now I have that as a loss. Now Kansas State won last year, but I've got Kansas winning this year. Who knows? We'll see. But that's where I have them as their second loss. And then they've got 3 easier games there at the back half of the schedule. So after that Kansas game, the back half of the schedule lightens up a bit. They've got at Houston versus Arizona State versus Cincinnati, should all be W's. And then I've got them at or home against Iowa State, last game of the season, Farm-again. I have that as a loss as well. Now, you could easily convince me, well, you won't easily convince me, but there is a case you could say that the 3 losses that I've got them down for, maybe they lose at West Virginia, perhaps they lose against Oklahoma State, and who knows, maybe they lose against Arizona, or maybe they only lose 1 or 2 games. But they play between Arizona, Oklahoma State, West Virginia, Iowa State, Kansas. They're playing a good chunk of the top end of the conference. The only team they're not playing is Utah. So this is a good team, really good team. I can't see them going undefeated though because of the difficulty of their schedule. Now, some changes that they've had in the coaching ranks. I think this is important to understand because this paints a little bit of a picture. On the offensive side, you can see that they've got a new offensive coordinator. So their old offensive coordinator, he left to go to Texas A&M, and they've got their offensive line coach, Connor Riley. He steps up and he takes on the role as a co-offensive coordinator. This is his 6th year at Kansas State. I've got a couple of nuggets about him later, which is why I think that they're going to be in good shape as the season rolls on. And then Matt Wells comes in as the co-offensive coordinator. He's also taken on the QB's role and associate head coach. So I'd expect him to have an influence on the passing game. He helped develop Chucky Keaton and Jordan Love at Utah State when he was the head coach there. That's how you'll likely know his name. He was also Texas Tech head coach from 2019 to 2021. So he's got quite a bit of experience. Connor Riley, I would expect to be really influential in the running game. And on the defensive end, one thing there is that they have no changes at the coordinator or their position coaches, and that unit's been together for 5 or 6 years, which is already paying dividends for them. They had one of the better defenses last year in terms of points allowed. You'll see that here in a little bit, and this unit's together. This is a program that develops their talent. And you'll see that here in a slide or two. When I look at one of the metrics I follow significantly is their point differential for teams. I like to see this because this tells me a little bit about how good they were. It doesn't tell you everything, but I do think it's helpful. So you can see Kansas State had on screen here. I'm displaying a graphic. Kansas State had of the new Big 12. Kansas State had the best point differential last year. So they had a 200-point differential. So they scored 200 points more than they allowed. Second best was Arizona at 162. Third best was Kansas at 94. So Kansas State, by a pretty good margin, they lost a couple of close games, but then when they were winning pretty big. What's interesting to note here, Oklahoma State, they only had a 34-point positive point differential. And you think about, they were really up and down throughout the season. They go 9-3. Kansas State goes 8-4. You could say that the ball bounced a little bit luckier for Oklahoma State in a sense last year than it did for Kansas State. I expect Kansas State to be better this year in those close games. Just of intrigue here, BYU was 4th worst in the conference at -81. So that's something for you to pay attention to this year. If BYU really struggles to get to a bowl game, pay attention to their point differential, because if they're losing every game, if they lose 7 games by an average of 6 points, and so they've got a 42. I can do math. A -42 point differential. Then, hey, I think that, to me, in my mind, that's improvement this year. I know that it might feel like a moral victory to some of you, but I think that's improvement. Now, a couple graphics here on recruiting, because again, I'm trying to give a broader picture of the program coming in here. And to me, this was really intriguing. So I went to 24/7 Sports and scraping their data. They've got their player rating system, right? So you've got 5-star, 4-star, 3-star. I didn't worry about 2-star, but they rate their 5 stars from a 98 rating all the way up to 110. The 4 stars start at 90, and you can say they go up until 97, and then 3 stars start at 80. So Kansas State, where have they been? Well, going back to 2020, they were 83.7, 85.5, 85.4, 86.5, 86.9. So those of you on audio here, you're not going to see, but that's an upward trend. So they went basically in the span of 5 years, their high school recruiting class average player rating. So this is their average player rating of those high schoolers that they brought in. They went from an 83.7 to an 86.9. So this was intriguing to me because they're not bringing in very many 4 stars. Their average rating is a sub 3-star player. So when you look at the success they've had the last few years, and you look at, they have a lot of continuity generally in the coaching ranks. They have had players get drafted. This is a program that knows how to develop their players. So when you hear that they've lost key players, that is important. That is a factor for sure. But they also know how to develop their players. And because the coaches have been around for a while, these players that are now going to be entering sophomore, junior, senior season, who are going to be getting some more playing time than they did in past years, they'll have been in the current system for a couple of years now, and that bodes well for Kansas State. Now, when you look at their ranking, recruiting, high school recruiting across the Big 12, you can see here on the graph that they're middle of the pack. For being one of the better performing teams on the field, they are middle of the pack in terms of recruiting ranking. This was really insightful for me. Now, I'm not looking at the ranking in terms of the class, the way that 24/7 puts up, the 5th best class or the 27th best class. Some of that is influenced by the number of high school recruits they bring in. To me, what's a little more insightful is the average player rating, because that says this is the quality of the player that they're bringing in. With the transfer portal now, you're not going to get all your players from the high school ranks, but high school is still an important pipeline to pay attention to. And so you may not need as many high school players because you're supplementing through the transfer portal, but it is important to keep note of the quality of talent that they bring in the high school portal there, high school ranks. So, all right, let's jump to the offense. So 3 key stories here on the offense. They've got new offensive coordinators. I talked about that for a minute. Connor Riley is he's been there for, this is his 6th season now, and a couple of notes here. In the past 5 seasons, this offensive line unit coached under Connor Riley, they've allowed less than 2 sacks per game, and they're the only Big 12 team that can say that, and they're only one of 4 Power 4 schools that can say that as well. And then I think what's even more insightful and impactful is that 4 out of his 5 years coaching that O-line, he's had at least 3 of his linemen get named to all conference honors. So they're turning over players, and they're developing them into all conference honors. And by the way, only 2 of those guys got drafted? 2 or 3 of those guys got drafted. So about 20% of his offensive linemen who are getting those all-conference honors are getting drafted. So that just means they're really good, solid players on the line. Now, that brings me to the second story, which is they're replacing much of this offensive line unit. But again, they're able to develop players. So I think this is the line will be good, but it will take a little bit of time to develop, because that's a unit of all the positions on the field that you got to take some time to mesh and be cohesive. We saw that last year with BYU. There was a struggle. Of note, Kansas State had 4 guys last year on the line that got named all Big 12 honors. 2 of them got drafted, and then another one, he's gone. So they've only got 1 guy coming back from that. But again, this team, they've averaged over 200 yards rushing per game for 2 seasons in a row now. They bring back DJ Giddens as a running back. He had 1,200 plus yards last year. They bring in Dylan Edwards, who was a transfer from Colorado. He had a splash of a game against TCU last year, and then he just wasn't really around after that. But he's got some dynamic athletic ability, so they're gonna have opportunity to really develop a strong running game this year. And then that brings me to Avery Johnson as my 3rd key story for the offense, which he was a 4-star player coming out of high school. He's from Kansas. They think in the program that they wouldn't have gotten him if he wasn't from Kansas, but he grew up wanting to be a Wildcat. Dive a little bit more into his profile here a little bit later. But he rushed 52 times last year for just under 300 yards on the ground. And that's about 5.7 yards per carry. So, and he had 7 touchdowns overall on the ground. 5 of them were against Texas Tech. That was, I watched that game, and I kept thinking to myself, is he a quarterback or is he just another running back? So he's good on the ground. Reports suggest he wants to show teams he can beat them with his arm this year. We'll see. I think that's going to be the key thing for him. If he develops that, they're going to be pretty scary good in terms of Big 12, relative to the Big 12. So a couple things about him, though. He's got a pretty good completion percentage. He had no interceptions. It was on a small sample size. It was something around, I think he threw just a little bit over 100 yards last year, or 100 yards. 100 passing attempts, so not a large body of work. He only played in a few different games. Most of the yardage that he threw for came in the fourth quarter. So that tells you I think he played in total about 5 games. He was playing garbage time essentially, and then he was pretty good on third down. He was good in third and long situations, passing the ball. Small sample size, but that's something to look for. And then one other note about him is that about a quarter of his passes were explosive passing plays. Now I measure explosive passing plays as those that go for 15 yards or more. So that's something to watch when BYU plays. And now BYU was actually pretty good last year. Oh, excuse me. Water bottle cap there. BYU was pretty good last year in defending the explosive play. And they're gonna have to be really good again this year because of who they're playing. But that's something that's going to be interesting to watch this year, particularly when they play Kansas State. There is that game. I expect that game to be a defensive game, and the team that can move the ball on the ground the most, I think, it's going to come down to the line of scrimmage. But I think the team that can run the ball better is likely the team that's going to win because they're going to be able to control. They're going to be able to control tempo, control the pace of the game. And from a passing standpoint, I don't have a lot of confidence yet at that point of the season in the quarterbacks for either of the teams that they're going to really be able to win the game with their arms. So something to watch out for. Now, defensively, a couple stories here, all right? So there's, first key story I mentioned, no staffing changes at the key spots. Defensive coordinator, everyone, they're all back. They know how to develop. They've had multiple defensive draft picks over the past several years. That leads me to the second point, is that I think the defense is going to carry the water in the early part of the season as the offense develops. And then the third key story here is that they've got good DBs and good DEs, the DBs and the DEs. So from a standpoint of the positions they've been developing over the last few years, these are the positions defensively that they've had guys that they've been sending to the NFL, and I think that's going to be so. In 2021, they had 2 defensive ends, including a first rounder, and they also had since 2021. Sorry, that's not in 21, but since 21, and then they've had 3 DBs drafted as well. And their coach, every coach is going to say this, but Chris Klieman did say he thinks their DBs are the best in the conference. And 2 players to watch: Keenan Garber, he's a DB, and then Brandon Mott, he is a defensive end. I want to say it was either 10 tackles for loss or 10 sacks last year. I think it was tackles for loss, but anyways, those are going to be 2 guys to pay attention to. All right, now I'm going to pivot from here to I'm going to share some data now on some charts. So those of you again on audio, bear with me here. I'll try to walk you through, and those of you who are viewing, you should be able to see the charts on screen if I've figured this out correctly here. All right, so I'm gonna run through a lot of these pretty quickly because there's a lot here, but gonna walk you through some offense and then some defense. Some of these are going to be standard metrics you're used to. Some of these are going to be more what I call advanced metrics. Now, total yards per game last year, Kansas State, they were pretty good last year. So they were 22nd in the country. They averaged 447 yards per game. Pretty good for a team. And when you look at where they were in terms of passing versus rushing, so they, again, last year it was 447 total yards, 246 in the passing game. That was good for 52nd in the country. And then on the ground, they were this is passing yards per attempt. They were 60th in the country, 7.4 yards per attempt. LSU was crazy good last year. They were almost 11 yards per attempt, and Air Force 12.5, right? They were the top, but they probably threw the ball 7 times all year and happened to go for more than 12 yards. So anyways, rushing yards. So Kansas State, again, they balanced. So they had 201 rushing yards per game last year. Again, really balanced. And per carry, 4.9 yards per carry. That was good for 29th best in the country, which I think is important here to know. And then a couple other advanced metrics. So one of the metrics that you'll hear me talking about quite a bit is offensive success rate. So this essentially, it measures the percentage of your plays that are deemed successful. And successful, I'll call it keeping your offense on schedule. So on first down, you get 5+ yards towards the first down. That is a successful play. On second down, you're getting 70% of the yards to go. So third down, you get the first down or you score. So let's walk this through one quick scenario. It's 1st and 10, you get 5 yards. That's a successful play. 2nd and 5, you need to get 70% of the yards. So you need to get, you got 5 yards to go. You need to get like 3.5 yards to get to, so you've got like a third and a little more than 1 to go. And then third, let's say you get that. And then third down, you don't get the third down. You have so you failed to be successful in that play. 3 plays, 2 were successful, 66% success rate. So the higher the success rate on offense, the better. They were 20th in the country at a 47% success rate. So almost 50% of their plays, they were keeping themselves on track. And you can see here on screen, if you're looking, they were pretty equal in terms of passing and rushing success. So 45% success rate for passing, just about 49% success rate for rushing. This is a really key metric that I'm going to keep following and sharing as the season goes on. I wasn't the genius who created it. That's due to some other. A lot of this data come from college football FastStar. Tell you about them more another day. Some geniuses that figured out how to put this data together. I just used some of my very elementary data analytics skills to put this to put together what build on the great work that they've done. Another metric here that's advanced: offensive line yards. This essentially measures the portion of rushing yards that can be deemed attributed to the offensive line. So it's an interesting one to look at. Kansas State was 51st in the country, about 3.2 yards offensive line yards per carry. So of their rushing yards, again, I told you about they were just under 5 yards per carry. Roughly through 3.2 of those you could attribute to the offensive line being good and giving you some push versus the running back simply just being amazing, being Barry Sanders and doing something amazing. And then the third advanced metric here on offense is offensive explosiveness. This one I won't get into great detail here because this one's a little bit of a tricky one to measure, but essentially the higher the rating here, the higher the more explosive the offense was in terms of big plays. And what's interesting here is actually BYU was 21st in the country, a 1.36 offensive explosiveness rating. Compare that to Kansas State. Kansas State was 103rd at a 1.2. Now again, I won't go into how you measure that, but it's a measure of explosiveness. What BYU's tells me is that they either couldn't move the ball, or when they did move the ball, they moved it pretty far. Not what I would deem as successful, because, hey, look, Kansas State, 103rd in the country. You'd like to see that better, but that's actually, for as good as his offensive success rate as they had, I would take their situation over what BYU had last year. Everyone would, clearly. Okay. Looking at the conference here, Kansas State was 4th best in the new Big 12 in terms of total yards per game. They were, they were 7th best in terms of passing yards per game, and then rushing yards per game, they were 5th best That's interesting. West Virginia and UCF were the two best in terms of rushing yards per game. And in yards per carry, Kansas State was 6th. UCF was 5.7. Kansas was 5.5. West Virginia is 5.3. I mean, those teams could run the ball pretty well last year. BYU, 3rd from the worst in rushing yards per carry. No surprise, 3.5. And then this one's interesting, sacks allowed. Now, Kansas State, they only allowed 16 sacks last year. They were 5th best in the conference in terms of the least amount of sacks allowed. BYU was pretty good. They were 6th best. They were right behind Kansas State, tied with TCU and Utah. They only allowed 19. So I know that the offensive line last year for BYU really struggled in the run game, but they actually were pretty good in terms of pass protection. Turnovers. So Kansas State, they only turned the ball over 12 times, once per game. That's pretty good. That's right where you want to be. They were 4th best in the conference. Yard differential, all right? So here's another metric that I've been tracking. Kansas State had a 76, just about a 77 positive yard differential. So averaged 77 more yards per game than what they gave up. I already went through the point differential there. Turnover margin, this will be something to watch against BYU as well. So they had a positive turnover margin at plus 10. They were plus 10. BYU was plus 1. So Kansas State turned other teams over, and they didn't turn the ball over. BYU turned other teams over, but they struggled to handle the ball. So that's something that you're going to want to pay attention to in the game coming up, particularly again with, is it going to be Retzlaff? Is it going to be Bohannon? Is it going to be one of the other guys at the quarterback position? That could really make or break that game, because BYU is going to have a small margin for error. And going back to offensive success rate, Kansas State was 3rd best in the conference. I'm going to skip ahead to some defensive metrics. Okay, now defensively, Kansas State was 31st in the country in terms of total points allowed. So they only allowed 21 points per game. That's pretty good there. In terms of total yards allowed, did I say total yards allowed last time? I meant total points. Only 21 points per game. Allowed 370 yards, 58th best. So I like to look at defensive quality at the points allowed and the defensive success rate, which we'll get to in a minute. Yards, that's tricky because that's also influenced by the by how much time the offense is allowing your defense. If your offense is really bad, your defense is going to be on the field more, and so you might give up more yards. So the total yards is not always the best indicator of defensive success, but it is important, because you look at who was the worst in the country. Well, North Texas, right? They were pretty bad. And BYU, they were 110th worst in the country at 417 yards per game. Not great, which actually, by the way, looking at BYU in terms of where they fell, points allowed, they allowed just under 30 points per game. They were 99th worst in the country. So this year, how good do they need to be to go to a bowl game? Well, let's look at a few teams. Texas Tech, they allowed 27 points per game, 74th best in the country. They got to a bowl game. Oklahoma State, interestingly, they allowed 27 points per game, 77th worst in the country. They got there. West Virginia allowed 27 and a half. They got to a bowl game. TCU allowed just almost 28. So right in that range, I think BYU needs to allow a few points less per game. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they can't get blown out the way that they were getting blown out last year. Passing yards per game here, Kansas State was 74th best in the country, 48th best in terms of rushing yards allowed. They only allowed 140 yards. That's going to be another key thing. Can BYU run the ball against Kansas State? I don't know. I'm concerned about that. If BYU wants to win, I think they're going to have to be able to run the ball. Get 100 yards, at least get 100 yards that game to be in contention. All right. Kansas State allowed 4.5 yards per carry. I would take that. If I'm BYU, I would take that. And then turnovers created, again, Kansas State was 16th best in the country. They generated 22 turnovers, so just about 2 a game. Scary good. And then sacks, so they were 24th best, or sorry, they were 79th best. They only got 24 sacks, 2 a game. That's not monstrous. That's not bad. That's middle of the pack, but to me that's interesting there. Now, defensive success rate. Offensive success rate, you want the highest percentage you can get. Defensive success rate, you want the lowest percentage you can get. And they were pretty good. They were 21st in the country at a 37.5% defensive success rate. So Penn State, that had a phenomenal defense, they were number one. They had a 29.5% success rate. And, Utah, they were 16th best. Utah had a good defense. I mean, they got as far as they did last year because they had a good defense. This is interesting. Defensive back havoc rate. So the percentage of plays that a defensive back gets an opportunity to either intercept the ball or break the ball up. 7% of plays for Kansas State. That was good for 39th in the country. This one's got a pretty wide spread in terms of percentages overall. And Iowa State was best in the Big 12. You can see they were 4th best in the country. Clemson, number 1. Florida State, number 3. I'll have some episodes maybe during the season where I go through these metrics in more detail. But what's interesting, BYU, I told you they were pretty good at the defensive back position last year. Turnovers, 6.9% havoc rate at the DB, ranked 45th. I know I'm throwing a ton of numbers at you right now, but if you're with me, still amazing. All right, I'm going to go through a few others here. Defensive pressure rate, 11.5%. Kansas State was only 110th in the country. So they weren't. So this is the percentage of plays where you are generating either a sack or quarterback hurry. So not as great. For context, Penn State was 28%. And BYU was 9%. So BYU's got to get much better. Kansas State, though, they weren't putting immense pressure, which could be good for whoever BYU's got in the backfield there. So there are quite a bit more stats here that I could go through. I'm flashing through them on screen. You can look at here, but ultimately, when I think about Kansas State and BYU, the key for the game for BYU is going to be, can you stop Kansas State from dominating the game on the ground? And then can you find a way to get some yardage on the ground? And then you've got a bevy of really good receivers. And what can you do to utilize them creatively? All right. So now I want to pivot real quickly. Couple things I want to talk about one thing I want to just pivot real quickly to is the question I brought up about the Big 12 and the quarterbacks. Does the Big 12 have the best quarterbacks in the conference, in the country? If in the spirit of the Olympics, I've been watching a lot of the Olympics, a lot of the swimming. Gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal. Well, I can't award those right now to a conference because the season hasn't been played, but I can at least do what they do in the swimming, do the qualifiers, do the heats. And where would I position gold medal, the fastest qualifier, the second, third fastest qualifiers? All right, when I look at the Big 12, a couple things I want to talk through here is you look at the quarterbacks that got over 3,000 yards in a previous season. The SEC has got it's at least 4. I'll have to go back and check and see if Jackson Dart at Ole Miss got it. There might be 5 there, but the Big 12 has 4 guys who have done it, and then they've got a couple guys who have paced towards it but didn't finish the season, and then they've got another guy or 2. They've got another 2 guys who have done it cumulatively between passing and rushing. So no other conference has that. The ACC doesn't have that. They have several good players. Cam Ward at Miami's done it. Kyle McCord going to Syracuse from Ohio State, he's done it. Will he be able to do it at Syracuse again? I don't know. He had great receivers at Ohio State. Big Ten, not even close. Dylan Gabriel's the only one who's done it. And when I say best, I'm not talking about who's got the best chance to win the Heisman. I'm not talking about most draftable players. I'm talking about who's going to be the best for their team in college, the best college quarterback group next year. And the Big 12 and the SEC, in my opinion, are fighting for that top qualifying spot. I would put the SEC in the top spot, but I would put the Big 12 right there. And I think they're both fighting for the gold medal. I don't think it's the SEC and then the Big 12 and the ACC are fighting for bronze and silver. I think it's Big 12, SEC fighting for the gold. One of those two are going to get the gold. The other one should get the silver. And then the Heisman could actually come out of Dylan Gabriel at Oregon or Cam Ward in Miami, or Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, Missouri. One of those teams is going to be really good. Texas, Quinn Ewers, I forgot. One of those teams is going to be really good, and so they're going to have 2 to 3 guys in New York. Big Ten should have one. ACC should have one. Big 12 might have one, but it depends, because if every team, if the conference contenders are, championship contenders are 10-2, 9-3, then I don't know that the voters are going to bring someone from the Big 12 to New York. But anyways, besides the point, let me run through the quarterbacks real quickly. Let's start with the guys coming in. Shedeur Sanders, 27 touchdowns, 3 interceptions last year. That's really good. He threw for nearly 4,000 yards last year. He's going to get drafted in the first round. I think he and Jalen Daniels are the 2 best quarterbacks in the conference. Second quarterback is Cam Rising. He threw for over 3,000 yards in 2022. Like him, hate him. I know that he's about to turn 99 this year, but he's going to be a really good quarterback, and he's quality. And then Alan Bowman, Rocco Becht. So those are the 2 guys that are returning. Now, when I made the note about over 3,000 yards, these are guys who are coming back. Every conference has a lot of quarterbacks who have potential. I mentioned Avery Johnson. He's got potential, but Big 12 has some bona fide proven production coming back. Rocco Becht is a freshman last year at Iowa State, threw for over 3,000 yards. Alan Bowman, Oklahoma State, threw for over 3,000 yards. I would expect all 4 of those guys to do that again this year. Jalen Daniels, he was pacing in the last 2 or 3 years. He's paced towards 3,000, but he hasn't been able to stay on the field. If he stays on the field, Kansas is going to go to the Big 12 title game, and that's my pick. And Jalen Daniels has a real shot at New York because he's that good. He's dynamic. He can run the ball, but he's not a run-first quarterback. He's accurate. He's also one of the most accurate quarterbacks. He was above 70%. And then Noah Fafita is the other guy who was pacing towards it. He didn't play in all 12 games last year because Jaden Delore was starting, but Fafita was on pace for over 3,000 yards, and he had an incredible completion percentage as well. I think it was close to 75%. So someone to watch as well there. And then you go to a couple other guys. DeQuan Finn goes to Baylor. Don't know if he's going to be the guy, but he. What's interesting about him is he was on pace for 3,000 yards between rushing and passing. He was also the MAC Player of the Year. And then you've got KJ Jefferson, who I think is going to have a really standout year this year. I think he's going to have a bounce back year. He's only thrown for, it was like 2,600 yards in 22 and 21 at Arkansas, but he had 600 plus yards of rushing each of those years. So he's going to get you each game, and I think at UCF he very well could pass for over 3,000 yards. So he's going to get you something like 275 yards in the air, 60 to 70 yards on the ground. That's incredible. He could be getting 350 yards per game easily in that system because that's a whole nother story for another day, KJ Jefferson, which we'll talk about when I preview that team. So there you go. I think I'm sure I left someone out there, but there you go. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions, comments, best way to reach me is drop a comment in the YouTube. If you're on audio, you can find me on Twitter at DJ Danny Jackson, or you can look this up, Third Down Analysis on YouTube. Leave a comment in the comment there. Like, subscribe, share. share any feedback. I've gotten some feedback already about shortening these episodes. This episode wasn't short as I was hoping, but I tried to make it short. But I did fit in quite a bit more this time. So hope you enjoyed. Thank you for joining. And go Cougs! I'm excited for the season. Excited to eat some cougar tails or get some. I love those I love those mint brownies that you get. BYU campus. They're simple, straightforward, but man, you can't go wrong with those. So thank you.